Welcome back, and we would now like to go into our session. It is titled Strengthening Climate, Energy, and Health Security. I would like to introduce the chair for the session, Professor Anar Koli from Soka University.
Thank you. I should say good evening. And thanks so much for joining us. And also I can see your enthusiastic face still. So thanks, really thanks for your that kind of patience. We have a very wonderful panel right now. This is the end, so just keep your patience a little bit more. I'm introducing first Dr. Ela Kokotsis from G7 Research Group. And she is the director of accountability of the G7 and G20 research groups. She has attended most of the G7 summits since 1994 and working on varieties of area, written broadly on the various aspects on global governance. And also she worked on research methodology of assessing summit compliance that we also heard in the morning. So I'm just directly going to her. Professor Dr. Ela.
Well, good morning, everyone, and greetings from Toronto, where it is 2:30 in the morning local time. So please do forgive me if I do appear a little bit tired. I'm going to do my best, of course. My sincerest thanks to the conference organizers for the opportunity to participate at today's important event. I would have loved to have been there in person in Tokyo. However, I am thrilled either way to be participating through video link. Now, in my discussion, I plan on addressing the 4 key questions that were outlined in the conference abstract. Those being, 1, how well have G7 summits governed climate change in the past through their collective commitments and ability to comply with them? Number 2, what further advances have come from recent summits influenced by G7 members? Third, how and when has Japan, particularly as a G7 summit host, effectively shaped summit action on climate change? And what assets does Japan have for doing so today? And finally, what are the most urgent and important actions needed by the G7 at Hiroshima to control climate change? Now, in terms of the first question, how well have the G7 summits governed climate in the past through their collective commitments, as well as their ability to comply with them? Our research at the University of Toronto, in addition to our recent co-authored book with Professor Curtin and Brittany Warren on this question, essentially concludes that over the summit's 48-year existence, the G7's climate performance has varied quite considerably over time. Although the climate crisis, as we know, has progressively become more severe. Since the summit's inception, back in 1978, the G7 has generated 479 discrete climate commitments, or 7% of the total across all subject areas. Compliance with the 99 climate commitments that we've assessed at the G7 Research Group in the year following each summit shows an overall compliance average of 74%, which is nearly on par with the summit's overall performance of 76 across all the issue areas that we've examined. Now, between 1979 and 2004, we saw compliance with climate commitments average around 72%. And between 2005 and 2022, it rose marginally to 76%. And what we concluded through our research is that since the Paris COP21 meeting in 2015, the G7 and the G20 summits have become increasingly supplemented by a number of ad hoc special climate summits, including, for example, the One Planet summits, the UN Climate Action Summit, and Joe Biden's Leaders Summit on Climate. And what we found is that every step of this intense sequence of additional climate summits over the past few years has effectively reconfigured global climate governance, spurring what we have found is stronger overall performance. Now, the notable exception was in 2020, where the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic diverted almost all of the G7 and the G20's attention away from climate change and delayed the UN's COP meeting in Glasgow for a full year. Now, the second question of today's program asks what further advances have come from recent summits influenced by the G7. And here we can draw on a few concrete examples. In Venice, 1987, the G7 pressed for the ratification of the Montreal Protocol, pushing for the phase out of ozone depleting substances. In Denver in 1997, we saw that the G8, along with Russia at the time, urged for the ratification of the Kyoto Protocol as the first international agreement to set binding greenhouse gas emissions targets for the developing countries. In Germany in 2015, under Angela Merkel, the G7 helped create the Paris Agreement with a goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Noting, I should say, that at this particular summit, the G7 countries themselves were amongst the first to ratify the Paris Agreement shortly following its adoption. And more recently in Cornwall, in 2021, the G7 showed strong performance on climate change, committing to a number of issues. First, to reach net zero by 2050, to cut emissions in half by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. The leaders also promised to end international financing for new coal power generation by the end of 2021, not their own, but international financing. They agreed on the importance of carbon pricing and other market-based mechanisms. They pledged to conserve or protect at least 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030. And significantly, they also recognized for the first time the role of nature-based solutions in addressing climate change. However, what we found last year at Schloss Alma was a policy reversal, with the G7 effectively failing to commit to further reduce its greenhouse gas emissions in keeping with the latest scientific evidence. Nor did the leaders promise to provide the long overdue climate finance of $100 billion a year for developing countries. And they also failed to end their own fossil fuel subsidies. Now, why the reversal? Well, the summit's agenda was largely dominated by Russia's war in Ukraine, with some G7 countries agreeing that public funding would even be necessary for some fossil fuel projects in order to reduce dependence on Russian energy. Now, as we look ahead to Hiroshima, it's important to understand where Japan, as G7 host in the past, has effectively shaped summit action on climate change. And additionally, what assets does Japan have for doing so currently? In '93, we saw Japan as G7 host call on the implementation and the ratification of the UN's Framework Convention of Climate Change, and also supported the Global Environment Facility as the key financial mechanism to fund the Rio Conventions on climate change and on biodiversity. In '97, Japan was key in shaping the Kyoto Protocol, which effectively established binding emissions targets for developed countries and created a market-based mechanism for trading carbon credits. At the 2008 Toyako Summit, the G8, again with Russia included, committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2050, compared to 1990 levels. And here Japan played a very pivotal role in negotiating the Toyako Framework for Action on Global Health, which for the first time in the summit's history directly linked climate change with global health issues. And what we saw at the 2019 Osaka summit was that Japan was able to gain support, direct support for the Paris Agreement by all G20 members, with the exception being, of course, the United States under President Trump. Osaka also introduced nature-based solutions at the summit and Indigenous people into their communique for the first time, recognizing that Indigenous communities represent 5% of the global population, but more importantly and significantly, protect 80% of the world's biodiversity and carbon sinks. So we've seen very strong performance by Japan over the years. Why? Because Japan possesses a number of critical assets for shaping climate action. For example, in terms of renewable investment, Japan invested $40.6 billion in 2020 alone, with the bulk, 70% of that directed towards solar power. Wind, hydro, and geothermal have also received significant Japanese financial investments. On technological expertise, of course, Japan is a world leader on clean energy technology, with the country ranking number 6 globally in installed renewable energy capacity. In terms of financial resources, Japan is a key provider of financial support to developing countries. In fact, Japan is one of the largest donors to the Green Climate Fund, with over 1.5 billion in contributions to date. And I should note that this number represents approximately 20% of the total contributions made to the Green Climate Fund across all countries. And I really think that that's something Japan needs to be applauded for. Japan also has tremendous diplomatic influence. As a major global economic power, Japan is a key player in numerous international organizations, including the G7, the G20, the United Nations, ASEAN, OECD, and the WTO. So Japan can very effectively leverage its diplomatic influence to build consensus across climate goals and to push other countries to make and take more ambitious action. And finally, Japan also has strong domestic political support, and this is important on climate issues, with 84% of Japanese people supporting the country's goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. So Japan is incredibly well positioned this year through these important assets to shape real action on climate change at the summit in a few short weeks from now. Now, in terms of the final question, what are the most urgent and important actions the G7 can take to control climate change when the leaders meet in Hiroshima in May? We know through the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change synthesis report, the IPCC synthesis report, that an impending climate catastrophe is quickly closing in. So what can the G7 do now? And I'll offer 8 very short recommendations and in no particular order. First, the G7 must ramp down fossil fuel subsidies and redirect those financial resources to green development initiatives. Almost $300 billion of public money was committed to the fossil fuel industry in 2020 alone. Secondly, the leaders must deliver and in fact go beyond their commitment to provide $100 billion a year on climate finance to marginalized communities and the global South. And this number should be in addition to the goal of providing 0.7% of gross national income, or GNI, as development assistance. Third, the G7 needs to strongly encourage private sector investment in climate finance through innovative funding mechanisms, including things like green bonds and green investment funds. 4, the leaders must do more to promote sustainable infrastructure investment in renewable energy projects, in public transportation, and in greening buildings. 5th, the G7 also more aggressively needs to support technology transfers, enabling the developing countries to adopt sustainable technologies at a much faster rate. Number 6, the leaders must also adapt disaster risk reduction strategies by prioritizing climate adaptation and climate resilience, particularly at the community level. And 7, nature-based solutions are critical through the protection of restoration of natural ecosystems around the world. And finally, transparency and accountability are also critical through the tracking and reporting on both the amount and the impact of climate finance that's been provided. And of course, all these recommendations are underpinned by very complex and very challenging regulatory policies which each of the G20 countries need to independently address. But the good news is that the G7 do share a very strong collective knowledge base, and they need to utilize their collective experience and their expertise by coordinating their investment strategies and also sharing best practices on both green development challenges and opportunities. So in closing, I think Hiroshima represents a very important opportunity and at a very critical time for the G7 to leverage its collective efforts and to use the tools that it has at its disposal to advance climate action. And I'll end my comments there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Kokotsis. I think it was a very comprehensive presentations. We are now moving our second presenter, Professor Miranda Schreurs. She also will be online. Let me introduce her. Professor Schreurs is in the Environment and Climate Policy in the TUM School of Social Science and Technology at the Technical University of Munich, Germany. And her main research areas are international and comparative climate policy, environmental politics, and low carbon energy transitions. And she is expert in many areas. I personally know her when I was working in University of Tsukuba with Professor Suzunaka Yutakas. And I think many of you also know her. She also was appointed by Chancellor Angela Merkel to the German Ethics Commission on a Safe Energy Supply. So I'm not taking more time. Professor Schreurs, please.
Thank you so very much for this introduction. And I am going to start by, sharing my screen here. Okay. So I actually had planned to be in this meeting in presence in Japan. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible because of something that I think is going to impact this G7 meeting. There was a nationwide strike here in Germany, and all the trains were shut down and all of the airports, the major airports, were shut down. And therefore, my flight to Japan was canceled. And the reason for this strike is because of the very high levels of inflation that are linked to the very high energy prices that are linked to the war in Ukraine. And so I think we'll have to remember that at this G7, the reality of what's going on in global security will be impacting the possibilities in other areas like climate and energy. So I'd like to first point out that we see a continued rise in global CO2 emissions, and these graphs show that to you. On the right-hand side, you see a graph that shows you emissions from the pre-industrial to the current levels, and that those emissions, while slightly declining in the G7 countries, which are at the bottom, we see a growth in emissions in other parts of the world that are developing and transitioning. And so one of the major challenges for the G7 will be not only continuing to bring down their own emissions, but also to assist and share the burden of the transition in other parts of the world. And on the bottom left, you see a graph with a line which shows you 800,000 years worth of CO2 emissions and then our current level, which is basically the scientific warning that we are entering, or we have already entered, a period of CO2 in the atmosphere that has not been seen in the period during which humans have been civilized, if we can call it that. We also just heard in Ella Kokotsis' presentation about the AR6 synthesis report that was produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I just want to point out to you that this very, very lengthy report synthesizes the last 5 years worth of reports from the IPCC. And it basically says we're in trouble, but we still have opportunities. We're in trouble because our current commitments, the nationally determined contributions, suggest that we are going to hit this 1.5 degrees C target sometime in the next few decades, and that it's going to be increasingly hard to stay within a 2 degrees centigrade target if we don't make some major changes soon. And they present a few different scenarios of what could happen if we don't bring our emission levels down, and that rather rapidly. Even if we bring them down today with a 1.5 degree target in mind, we will still be leaving a world for next generations, those that are born today, that will see a world that is much warmer than any of us at our ages have experienced. And if we really don't act, then we are seeing by the end of this century the potential for the child that is born today to be seeing temperatures that could be as high as 4 degrees centigrade higher. And we really need to avoid that, because with every 0.01 degree centigrade increase in temperature, we're also seeing the melting of glaciers, we're seeing sea level rise, we're seeing extreme storms, and a world of anything above 1.5 degrees centigrade becomes a world that is increasingly scary and that will lead to multiple new challenges. This meant, this report influenced the United Nations Secretary General, who, as the report was being released, made a plea, and I think this plea is important for the G7 meeting. Net zero electricity generation by 2035 for all developed countries. This is something the G7 should be pushing, as well as a net zero target that suggests a total net zero, not just in the electricity sector, as close as possible to 2040. So this means that the G7 and the rest of the world are not where the science says we need to be. We need to do more. And this means many things, such as the ceasing of licensing or funding of new and old gas initiatives, stopping the expansion of existing oil and gas reserves, shifting subsidies from fossil fuels to a just energy transition, as we have heard from several of the previous presenters, establishing a pathway country by country for how we plan to phase down and eventually phase out the use of oil and gas, speed up efforts at the energy transition, and fulfill and expand climate adaptation and mitigation financing commitments. Many of these points have been mentioned by our previous speakers. So where are we? The G7's share of greenhouse gas emissions is still at about 1/5 of the global total, even though that is not our share of the global population. In comparison, China, yes, is much higher at 33%. The European Union as a whole at 7%. And within the G7, we see, of course, a fairly large difference. I have listed the G7 countries by the size of their proportion of global emissions. The US is now at 12.5%, Japan at 2.87%, Germany at 1.76%, and so on down the list. That means the G7, although they have done things to cut emissions, and their emissions are lower than they were in 1990, still need to do much more. The G7 countries have increased their nationally determined contributions. So you see here Canada with a net zero target for 2050, the same for the US, for Japan, for the UK, for France, as well as for Italy, Germany, due to strong public pressure, is the one G7 country that has a 2045 net zero target. All of the countries are going to have to establish targets that go beyond where they are now. This will not be easy politically. This is still something that will need a lot of domestic discussion as well as global discussion, but it will be necessary if we want to stay within temperature ranges that are reasonable. We do see changes in renewable energy capacity. This is the 2022 Renewable Global Status Report produced by REN 21. And you can see that there has been a steady increase in the capacity available with photovoltaics. And you can see that Japan is one of the major countries here, as are Germany, the United States, and interestingly, India and China are also major players in this area. I wanted to point out that wind power capacity looks a little different. Wind power capacity has expanded also dramatically in many parts of the world, but not equally throughout the G7. And this is an area where I think we will have to see more because wind power is one of the complementary forms of renewables to solar. Of course, there are also other possibilities. Japan, for example, has potential geothermal power. We see here China, a major player, Germany, a major player with wind, the United States, United Kingdom, but what we do not see on the list here is Japan, and that suggests also that there are some additional challenges that need to be overcome for this expansion. So I just pulled out two of the G7 countries, Germany, where I live now, and Japan, which is the host of the next G7. And wanted to point out that although both of these countries are leaders in the expansion of renewables, Germany in 2022 depends a little bit on which source you look at, but was getting about 45% of its electricity from renewables, has set a target to be 100% renewable dependent in its electricity sector by 2035, 80% by 2030. But you can see that there's still a substantial share of both lignite, hard coal in the mix. And this 6% of nuclear energy is now down to 3%. And in 2 weeks' time, the last two nuclear power plants will be shut down in Germany, which means that we will have still a substantial share of gas and coal in the mix, and we will need to dramatically increase renewables. The Japanese situation is even tougher. You see solar at about 9%, water, hydropower at about 8%. Renewables have increased dramatically, but we see a huge share still of coal and liquid natural gas, as well as other fossil fuels in the Japanese electricity mix. Clearly, much more needs to be done to expand the renewables. I was in Japan just a few weeks ago, and I went to visit the family where I lived in 1980 in Hitachi Omiya in Ibaraki Prefecture. They're farmers. And this is the back of the area where they live. And you can see the solar panels that are being put into the countryside. And I must say, I think there could be a little bit more work done on thinking about how solar is expanded. It's not often on the rooftops, but instead on fields or forests that have been cut down. And we see public opposition. And I think this suggests that a little bit more urban planning and rural planning on solar is necessary. In the Bavarian region where I live, there are also a lot of solar panels. They tend to be put much more on roofs than I've seen in Japan. This is something that we could consider, how planning around the development of renewables could perhaps also increase acceptance for renewables. We mentioned fossil fuels in the discussion today. So I took a look, how much subsidies are Japan and Germany providing for fossil fuels? And according to a 2022 OECD report, Japan's government is supporting fossil fuels through tax relief and direct transfers on the order of 356 billion Japanese yen, which is about 2.7 billion US dollars. So that's much less than the 300 billion subsidy at the global level, but it's still a long ways to go. And if we look at Germany, because of the war in Ukraine, fossil fuel subsidies have actually increased. This is in part as direct support to industry that's being heavily impacted by the war, as well as subsidies to consumers who are seeing their energy bills increasing by 65% in 2022 compared to 2021. So here, a 7.2 billion US dollar equivalent of fossil fuel support. These subsidies will have to be ended, but we need to do this in a way that does not threaten democracy. The G7 are the democratic country leaders of the world, and we have heard and we know that democracy is far less stable than we thought it was just a few years ago. We've seen the protesters in Israel on the streets defending their democracy. We have seen calls for greater democracy in some European Union countries like Poland and Hungary. So the question is, what can the G7 do to support democracy? Because it's a crucial basis for all action related to biodiversity, climate change, environment, as well as human rights. We need to accelerate, speed up renewable energy expansion, but we need to do it in a way that supports the rural communities that are hurting in so many countries. We know that in Japan, with the aging population in many rural areas, communities are simply suffering, they're dying out. Renewable energy, when done the right way, could really be something to support these rural communities. But it does mean we need more investment in the necessary grid infrastructure. It will be hard, but we need to move up the net zero targets to around 2040 as called for by the UN Secretary General. We need to expand battery and other storage capacity so that on really sunny days, the electricity produced from solar, or on really windy days, the wind produced electricity can be stored for use on days when there isn't so much wind or sun. We need to eliminate those remaining subsidies for fossil fuels, and we need to phase out coal use well before 2030. Let's aim for something like 2025 to 2028. All of this will require support for just transitions, because otherwise we are going to see protest movements like we see in the streets of France, rejecting higher prices for gasoline, or rejecting the support for climate action. And we have to be fearful that support for the war in Ukraine, the Russian war that is driving up these energy prices, could weaken. And so what's really important, we need to do what we can in areas that will allow us to improve energy efficiency. We've seen some great trends here, 20% reduction in energy use in Germany as a result of people's wanting to cut their use of fossil fuels coming from Russia. But we need to also invest in a skilled labor capacity building project. There simply aren't enough people who know how to put photovoltaics in, or who know how to develop green hydrogen. So we need to invest in our schools and in our universities. We need to phase out the conventional motor in the transport sector. Transport sector is 30 to 35% of emissions in our G7 countries. We need to expand research into green hydrogen and biofuels because some sectors will not be easy to electrify. The steel sector, the glass sector, the chemical sector. We need alternatives, and green hydrogen is an area where we see a lot of potential. We need to continue support in this. And as has been mentioned already, we need to promote and regulate green financing. I have just a few more recommendations that I'd like to add to the list. And one is to mobilize the digital technologies and artificial intelligence developments that are rapidly changing the world. Let's mobilize these for the energy transition. Let's work with young people in helping us to do that. Let's engage them, which is also a part of our democratic backgrounds. Let's expand financial support and capacity building for the energy transitions in developing countries. And let's do what we can in areas that are easy to address. Reduce packaging waste, eliminate one-way plastic use, require greater recycling. Less material input means less energy use. It also means less waste and less destruction of biodiversity. We need to link biodiversity protection more strongly to climate change. We need to reforest, afforest. We need to green our cities where we're going to have heat island impacts. We need more sustainable forestry management. And we should develop climate clubs with developing countries to accelerate their energy transitions because that is where the emissions are growing now. And to recognize the positive benefits that will come from the clean energy transitions, providing support for creative societal responses such as a sharing economy. And last but not least, we need to commit to a clean energy transition Marshall Plan for the Ukraine when this war hopefully ends soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Schreurs, for your very extensive and also very comprehensive presentations. Now we are moving towards our next presenter, Dr. Mark Elder. He is from Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. He is the Director of Research and Publications in the Strategic Management Office at IGES Institute in Japan. IGES is one of the leading environmental institutions in Japan. And also Dr. Elder, he led various research projects on environment and sustainability, governance, and also sustainable development goals. He also authored and also co-authored a number of books, publications related this area. Dr. Elder, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Koli, for this kind introduction. Today, I would like to talk about energy and climate security at the G7 in context of the Ukraine war. I really appreciate Miranda's very comprehensive presentation, and I knew that, and also the other presentation. And so I knew that the background would be well covered, and so I would like to focus more on maybe one of the obstacles to the government's thinking on this issue. And I know and I appreciate that Hachioji-san's presentation this morning was very he's a diplomat, so his presentation was very diplomatic, and he indicated that the G7 would focus on maintain its support for net zero and the climate agreements. But nevertheless, we can see from the government actions that they're really kind of more concerned with energy security. And there's a lot of what the governments are actually doing is more investment in fossil fuels, actually. So, although I think we can see that there is more investment in renewable energies, which is good, but also more investment in fossil fuels, which is not helping. But I know the Ukraine crisis is definitely the urgent issue at the moment, but just because of that doesn't mean that the climate crisis has paused just because of the Ukraine war. And the climate crisis is already causing major economic and health damage. And this damage will continue to escalate. And I think there's not been enough attention to this damage. And not only the climate crisis, but there are also various other crises which have been referred to as like crossing planetary boundaries. And so other environmental crises like biodiversity and pollution, and meaning that the Earth's ability to support humans is at risk. So not just the Ukraine war is with us. And so therefore, I mean, I think the recommendation, the big picture recommendation is that G7 needs to maybe prioritize climate security, which is actually a prerequisite for these other priorities, and the G7 should recognize the concept of planetary boundaries, which actually has not been recognized by governments yet. So, and also I knew my fellow panelists would report to you the news from the latest IPCC assessment report last week, so I won't go into that. I'm a political scientist, not a climate scientist, but anyway, I can maybe go over a couple of points that I'm reading in the news that are maybe easier to understand than the IPCC report. So for example, Antarctica is melting, Greenland is melting, and we have a lot of cities on the coast like Tokyo and New York and the state of Florida. These maybe areas are going to be vulnerable a lot sooner than maybe people thought. And food security, we have droughts and floods. Agricultural competitiveness is mentioned. The farmers are going to have to change their crops. The crops that they're growing now aren't going to grow sooner than they expect. We have extreme weather damage. I looked it up in the US in 2022, $165 billion of damage. We couldn't afford to do anything about climate 10 years ago, but now we are going to afford all this damage. There are large-scale forest fires in California, Canada, Siberia, and then if you actually Google these forest fires, you notice that they're actually in a lot of other places that aren't necessarily in the news. There's refugees from climate-related disasters. Military installations are threatened by climate change. Another one that stood out to me is the melting permafrost. So like in Russia, Siberia has a lot of permafrost and the buildings are built on it. And when it melts, then the buildings like crack and fall down and fall apart. I mean, so like as my just simple-minded opinion, like Russia should be worried about Siberian infrastructure collapsing instead of fighting wars. But anyway, and the other interesting point is that the climate crises and other crises, actually they're going to threaten energy security itself, including fossil fuels. So we have a concept in the sustainability called the food, energy, water nexus, and the reality is the energy production, actually I didn't know this before, but like coal-fired electric power requires a lot of water. So does nuclear power for warming, for cooling the reactors. I mean, agriculture needs a lot of water and energy. Water production needs a lot of energy. And actually, the researchers at our institute a few years ago, they noted that like India at that time had plans for so many new coal-fired power plants, but there's actually not enough water for them because India is very severely water constrained, and it's already there's kind of conflict between the coal-fired power plants and the agricultural production regarding water in India. And in these oil pipelines, like the Alaska pipeline and these Siberian pipelines, they're built on the permafrost, supported by pylons. So when this permafrost melts, it means the oil pipeline is going to collapse and break and become useless. unless you like take measures to like use more energy to refreeze the area around the pipelines, like all across, like from north to south of Alaska. Otherwise, it's going to like collapse. And not only that, there's a river I read going next to the Trans-Alaska pipeline, which is moving towards the pipeline. These large-scale forest fires are threatening electric power transmission, like in California. Actually, the power lines maybe caused the fires to begin with, and then the fire worsens the power shortage. And French nuclear power plants get their water from rivers. Well, but when there's a drought and the river dry up, then they have to shut down the nuclear power plants. So energy security itself is being threatened by this climate crisis. And so there's going to be a limit. I mean, we're really running into limits of this, the fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are not the solution for energy security. And the International International Energy Agency had a report last year. We need to stop new fossil fuel investment to achieve the 1.5 degree target. We need to stop basically now. Otherwise, we won't achieve it. And the reality is new fossil fuel production takes several years, to set up the drilling equipment in the, North Atlantic Ocean or new gas extraction in the South Pacific. So it takes several years. So this is not a solution to short-term energy security, because by the time these projects actually produce any oil or gas, the Ukraine war will be over probably. I'm not necessarily, but it could be over. And by that time, maybe we wouldn't need it anymore. And then the new fossil fuel investments, they produce for 20 or 30 years, so they're like carbon bombs. But if they have to be, we have to take them out of production after 5 or 10 years because of the climate crisis, then they're going to become stranded assets and they'll become economical. And what a lot of people don't realize already outside of the environmental community, I notice, is that renewable energy is actually already cheaper than fossil fuels in many areas. And there was a report recently, even in the US, not just for new power generation, but even like existing coal-fired power plants it's cheaper to shut them down and replace them by renewable energy, like already. And so like in the US, the utilities, they're ready for the utility scale renewable energy. So I'll echo my fellow panelists' recommendations, like we need to phase out fossil fuels at least, starting with coal. And then I think recently in the energy discussion, there's a lot of talk about electric vehicles and renewable energy. But if you're really worried about energy security, the first thing to do is prioritize conservation and efficiency. And there's certainly not enough of that at all. It's not just about electric vehicles. So this is the quickest and cheapest way to strengthen energy conservation. It actually generates profits. It's not a cost, it's an investment. And like one way we could do this is, comes to mind, is the cryptocurrencies. And these, especially anything based on blockchain, uses like huge amounts of energy. So and this increasing cryptocurrencies is using up a huge amount of energy. So if the finance ministers think that these cryptocurrencies aren't really all that useful for anybody except for criminals, then maybe this is another good area where we could save energy. And so we need to prioritize things like energy efficiency standards and building standards. And then in the transport sector, again, a lot of people are emphasizing electric vehicles, but what we really need to do, I think, is have more public transportation to reduce the energy demand and not just emphasis on personal transportation vehicles. And another issue coming up is critical minerals, because these critical minerals are necessary for various technologies like renewable energy and and especially the electric vehicles. They need to be mined. This also causes environmental damage. So we need to manage the critical minerals together. And to do this, together with renewable energy, and to do this, we need more circular economy to have more like recycling and reuse the critical minerals and not just keep mining new ones. And so, so therefore, in conclusion, we need to really prioritize climate security is necessary for the energy security as well as food security. The Ukraine war is not a reason to hit pause on climate action or accelerate investment in fossil fuels. The climate crisis is getting worse. The Ukraine war didn't pause it. And new fossil fuel investment cannot increase energy security in the short term, and it's more expensive. So, like, why do you want more fossil fuels? So, anyway, that I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elder. Now we are moving towards Professor Hideaki Shiroyama. Professor Hideaki Shiroyama is a professor of public administrations in the Graduate School of Law and Politics and Graduate School of Public Policy at University of Tokyo. He is also the director of the Institute for Future Initiatives. He also serves as a member of various government advisory council on higher education, nuclear safety, consumer safety, and also artificial intelligence and information technology. Professor Shiroyama.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I think that my role in this session might be to put another dimension also in the multiple crises. We have talked about climate security and energy security, sometimes trade-off, but sometimes compatible to each other. That's a big issue. But in addition, we have an issue of the health security issue. And maybe, I mainly talk about how the health security issue are dealt with in the context of the G7, especially relating to Japan. But kind of the hidden issue, maybe, which may be necessary to be discussed at the later, might be the interaction among those several crises, the energy issue and the health security issue and climate issue are interacting with each other, and how to deal with these kind of complexities might be the big issue. For example, if we think about the fossil fuel issue, which was dealt with by the previous speaker, it was the cause of it is causing the climate change, but it also the source of the air pollution, which is not good for health. That's a fact for the last several decades. And also the food issue, the diet pattern might have impact on the energy consumption, but also have impact to the health. And forms of the community, the public transit issue was discussed, but walking is very important for the health. So walkable community can be good for health and climate. So how to deal with those kind of the multiple crises in an integrated way in the local level and global level, that might be the potentially the important question. So having those kind of the question in mind, I'd like to talk what I prepared for my presentation. Thinking about the series of the G7 and G8 summit hosted by Japan, actually, since the beginning, the health-related issue was picked up. I myself was surprised to find that in 1979, the first Tokyo summit already, the hunger and malnutrition issue was picked up, and that was the first time. And the nutrition issue is a very important issue as a part of the diet, having impact on the health, but also can be potentially important relating to the climate issue. And that was picked up since the beginning. But especially for the summit since the 21st century, the Kyushu, Okinawa, Hokkaido, Toyako, and Ise-shima, three of them are dealt with the global health issue in the different perspective and having a big impact on that. For example, the Kyushu Okinawa Summit, G8 Summit at that time, the July 2000, let's see. Yeah, which dealt with the infectious disease issue, including the HIV/AIDS and TB, and malaria. And actually, after the G8 summit, Japan took an initiative to organize a so-called Okinawa infectious disease initiative. Japan committed about $3 billion for that purpose, and leading the process for the setting up of a so-called global fund to fight with the AIDS and TB and the malaria. And global fund is currently a very big funder for the infectious disease issue, and much larger than the WHO, for example. So that kind of setting up the global fund for dealing with the infectious disease, that was the achievement in the Kyushu Okinawa summit. After the 8 or 7 years, Japan hosted the Toyako summit, and at that time, the three target of the MDG is relating to the health. So partly because of that, the G8 tried to set that new framing for dealing with the issue. One of the key idea at that time was the going beyond the infectious and plastic diseases. The point is that initially the regime has been focusing on the vertical approach, tackling with the specific disease, including the AIDS and TB and the malaria, and that's fine. But the cross-cutting aspect and the cross-cutting strengthening the health system is very important as a basis for that. That's a kind of the emerging the recognition at the time. So because of that, at the Toyako summit, the health system strengthening the perspective has been emphasized in this summit. And so that is one of the big achievement in the Toyako summit. Following that, in the 2016, Hiroshima summit was held. That was just after the setting up SDG in 2015. And also that was just after the so-called Ebola crisis in Africa, which happened in 2014 and 15. So responding to this thing, and there are several initiatives taken in this Hiroshima summit. And one is that in responding to the Ebola outbreak, the strengthening of the public health emergency preparedness and responding capability, that was one thing which was emphasized. You may remember that at that time, for example, the MSF noticed the outbreak relatively early stage, but WHO was relatively late to declaring the public health emergency. And because of that, the normal UN system cannot deal with that, and the so-called AMIA, the UN Special Mission Force, was deployed, just like a PKO force. So it was helpful for responding to the immediate perspective, but whether it is really effective or not, that's the issue. And having those kind of the experience in mind, the strengthening the preparedness for the public health emergency, that's one thing. And another item, and which is still important currently, is the strengthening of the UHC, universal health coverage. That's a Japanese government favorite item, partly because that Japan introduced universal health coverage in the 1960s, relatively early stage, and that was thought that was good to the economic development, but also for the good health with the relatively low cost. So Japan tried to promote the kind of idea to be exported to the developing countries and other countries. And another item, especially emphasized by the developed countries in G7, was the antimicrobial resistance. So too much use of the antimicrobial the medicine might have a negative effect for the effective use for that. So that kind of thing was picked up in the Hiroshima summit. And so those are the kind of the thing which has been discussed, and in that context, in the Hiroshima, promoting the UHC and promoting the is one of the big item, and Japan took the initiative to set a process for the UHC 2030, for example. So that's what has been done so far. And for example, in the process of the Hiroshima, I myself was involved a little bit, but there was a kind of the public-private collaborative platform to bring together the expert and government official to set up an agenda, preparation for the agenda. So the similar thing is now attempted relating to the Hiroshima G7 summit, and I myself has been involved in that process. So I'd like to share with you what has been discussed preparing for the Hiroshima summit. So this is just the summary of the draft recommendation for promoting the global solidarity for advancing health system resilience by the Global Health Task Force. This is what I mean, kind of the public-private partnership type of the platform, bringing together the expert and the ministry's official together to identify the possible issue. And also we have a dialogue with the international advisory member and also the stakeholder in the Global South and the consumer society, the organization and the civil society organization. And the basic thing we noticed that which is important is that resilience of the health system. So basically it's a continuation of the Toyako and the Hiroshima in that health system and universal health coverage is important, but it's not a separate item. It have to be dealt with in the integrated, the complex crisis situation. So it have to be responsive to the crisis time. So those two aspects have to be integrated. It means concretely, for example, that sometimes health workforce is very important, responding to the various the crisis, and also the manufacturing capability is also necessary for responding to the crisis, just like COVID. But also it can be utilized for the normal situation for responding to the influenza, for example, and others. So how to make sure the compatibility between the crisis and inter-crisis period, that's important. And also we have to promote this kind of thing to establish for establishing global solidarity under the current geopolitical tensions. So we need a collaboration, but we have also the conflict. So how to make sure that in that respect, maybe the role of the G20 is also interesting and important. For example, as I will explain later, responding to the current COVID crisis, the idea of the pandemic fund was promoted and finally established, actually, by G20 in Indonesia last year. So there was a concern that maybe it might be difficult to make an agreement under the current situation, but finally it was successful. China and Russia, at least, did not oppose that. And in that respect, Indonesia took a very important initiative. So those are the basic point. So I don't have enough time to deal with the detail, but I just pick up the three main issues which was dealt with in the report and will be put on the agenda on the Hiroshima summit. One is the universal health coverage under the new version, under the complex crisis. That's what I explained. And 100 Days Mission Plus is the idea originally put by UK government in G7 2021 for promoting the vaccine development for 100 days. So we could make a vaccine for 1 year. That was the game changer. That's true, but it have to be shortened to the 100 days. That was the original idea of the UK, but Japan tried to expand the idea not just for the development phase, but also to the access and distribution phase should be the reform. That's the idea. And global health architecture relating to that, as I mentioned at the beginning, that it's not just a health crisis. The climate crisis and health crisis are interacting to each other. And also, for example, food issue is closely relating to that. So for dealing with that, the kind of multi-sectoral and multi-layered and multi-level architecture have to be established. It's not just the issue of the WHO. So more broader, the governance have to be discussed. So this is just the detail of that. I don't have time, but to make sure the UHC, not just the idea, how to implement that responding to each country's situation, that's important. And also for facilitating the 100 days mission, we have to make an coordination of the approval and the clinical trial process, harmonization, and also linking between the R&D process and distribution process is also important. And as I mentioned, that the multi-layered global health governance is needed, bringing together not just the health issue in the narrower sense, climate change also have to be dealt with, as I mentioned at the beginning. And also, global level agreement is very important, that's true. But also, in reality, regional level collaboration is important even for the emergency workforce or the manufacturing of the vaccine or distribution, or even for the surveillance. So this kind of the multi-layered system have to be established. So those are the kind of thing. So we are discussing at the moment, and basically I think that kind of thing will be discussed in the G7 in Hiroshima. And the final thing I'd like to say, the final point here, that G7 has a role to play in this area as a major technology player and financial players. But the key issue is the relations in cooperation with the global south. So the vulnerable people are the most affected by those kind of the crisis. But also, thinking about the manufacturing and distribution of the medical countermeasures and so on, the collaboration with the global south is very important. So in that respect, this year, Japan is leading the G7, but India is leading the G20, and the collaboration between these two are important. And India is actually played an important role for responding to the corona, for dealing with the manufacturing of vaccine and distribution. So maybe those are the kind of the perspective, I think, which is necessary for discussing about the G7 role. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor Shiroyama, for your excellent presentations. And also thanks to all of the panelists of this panel, Strengthening Climate, Energy, and Health Security. Now the time for question and answers. So the floor is open. Please raise your hand, those are interested to ask questions. Yes, I can see over there, please.
I wish to put the question to Dr. Schreurs. It seems that in Germany they are terminating use of nuclear power reactors, but Germany still uses a lot of coal to produce electricity, and it seems the global warming is proceeding faster than thought. So even though renewables may be introduced, that cannot be keep pace with the pace of the global warming. So I wonder if Germany can change the course to reintroduce nuclear power generation. What is the discussion in Germany?
Thank you very much for your question. As I mentioned, the last two nuclear power plants are to be shut down on April 15th of 2023, so just in a few weeks' time. And although there are a few voices saying maybe we need to continue with nuclear, in Germany, that's a small minority. And there are several reasons for that. One is that the war in Ukraine points out that nuclear facilities can become powerful weapons of destruction if they are attacked, and therefore there's a lot of concern here. Second is the still huge problem of what do we do with the high-level radioactive waste that is left for future generations to worry about, and we don't know what their financial or political situation will be. Right now, it looks like it will take Germany somewhere between 50 and 100 years before it can have an operating repository for high-level radioactive waste. And that leads to dangers because the nuclear waste is an interim storage above ground. And of course, in a world where there's also terrorism, that's also frightening. Third, nuclear energy is seen as too expensive. And as we've seen with the climate problems, we had a serious drought in Europe last year. And as a result, there was not enough water in the rivers in France to cool their nuclear facilities. And therefore, about 50% of the nuclear power plants in France had to be shut down. And Germany had to help France supply electricity to the country. And so in Germany, there's a very strong feeling that just because of climate change, we can't pursue, therefore, nuclear. Instead, we need to speed up energy efficiency and we need to speed up renewables. So I know the thinking in Japan is also very controversial, but in Germany, there's a very clear position on this.
Thank you. Who is the next one? Is there any question? Yes, please.
I hope these presentations are available to a lot more people. Everyone has been so impressive. Thank you. You heard some very impassioned pleas about nuclear disarmament. One of the things that we just couldn't cover everything is the institutionalization of adversity amongst countries that point nuclear weapons at one another, which would seem to me to lead to the conclusion that there's a concordance of interest in the movements to protect the climate and the movements to get rid of nuclear weapons. Do you have any ideas how we might amplify our voices to protect the climate and get rid of nuclear weapons in a stronger alliance that would help both of these causes that personally I see as integral?
That's a very good question. I haven't thought of it in detail. Maybe I'll use this opportunity to return my question to you that I had on your panel, which is related to nuclear weapons production, which is that nuclear weapons production actually creates a lot of hazardous waste and nuclear waste. And I mean, I'm working at an environmental institute, so to me, this is kind of where these issues are intersecting. And it occurred to me that, I mean, of course, Japan was the victim of the real nuclear war, but basically after the atmospheric testing, the main victims of nuclear weapons have been the people involved in the production of the nuclear weapons, with like radiation sickness and the people living around the areas of these. So actually the countries that produce more nuclear weapons are actually the ones that suffer the most damage from the nuclear weapons because of this environmental pollution. And so to me, this is the like an intersection of a kind of so like nuclear weapons is basically like an environmentally polluting activity that, yeah. So I mean, yeah, maybe that doesn't really answer your question, but
I think in online also I can see some responses. Dr. Kokotsis, do you like to add or respond to this question?
I actually had a question for one of the speakers, not on this issue, but on something else.
Okay.
So I have my hand raised because I do have a question.
Okay, before that, is there any other response for this question, or should we go? No, I think that was excellent, but because it was not specified the speaker, that's why I'm just asking. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you for the question, but I'm working rather on the more, how to say, the technical issue and the public administration type of issue. But the issue of the nuclear is very interesting from the institutionalization perspective, especially how to deal with, different value and different application and so on. So in that, nuclear is utilized not just for weapon, not just for the energy production, but also for the medical use. And sometimes, it can be the part of the medical equipment and devices, but also having a health impact is also important. So, the issue of the nuclear have to be dealt with from the multiple perspective. So, I'm not sure the current regime is enough to deal with the kind of the issue you are dealing with, but nuclear has an experience for dealing with the issue from the multiple perspective, and that kind of institutional experience has been, utilized, have to be utilized, have to be expanded. So in that respect, I think that we can think of the concrete thing, from the experience of the institutionalization of the nuclear utilization. That's just a minor point I'd like to add.
Thank you. Yes, I think I'm just going to online our presenter. Sorry, because sometimes I missed that. It's always happening. My apologies. So I think both of you have two questions or some kind of responses. Please go on.
Thank you. On the question and the issue of nuclear, I actually had a question for Miranda, and that's regarding the use of small modular nuclear reactors. We know that their smaller size and the reduced capital cost of producing them is suitable for, a wide range of applications, including remote or off-grid locations or within, industrial applications, military use. And I was actually surprised to realize that Germany is shutting down its final nuclear reactors within the coming weeks. I realized it was imminent, but not that soon. So I'm wondering what Germany's position is on the use of small modular nuclear reactors as a response to energy security. And perhaps somebody from the Japanese side can comment on Japan's position on these devices, as well, as they're really starting to see broad and expanded application across Canada. So I'm really interested in understanding Germany and Japan's position on these. Thank you.
Okay, let me jump in here with a couple of comments. One on the question of nuclear as a weapon. I think something we need to be very careful in thinking about the expansion of conventional nuclear is that is also the basis for having the knowledge capacity for developing nuclear weapons. And what we see is that all nuclear weapon states are the states that are most aggressively pursuing conventional nuclear, plus authoritarian states. And I think there is a link here that is often not thought through very well. A second thought that is very important with the small modular reactors, they're one, still expensive. Two, we haven't talked at all about the security dimension of these. Do you really want to have small nuclear reactors in a world of terrorism? Think about every nuclear reactor you've ever seen. They are guarded with high security, with weapons, with fences. You're not allowed anywhere near them. How are we going to do this with small nuclear module reactors? Even though they are less likely to have a meltdown, they are still making use of radioactive materials. Yes, nuclear is, we use nuclear in the medical field. That's very clear. But we also have to recognize the different levels of radioactive materials that are produced by their different uses. And high-level radioactive waste is dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years. So we're not talking about waste that will, in a couple of hundred years, be cleaned up. We're talking about leaving something for future generations that we know very little about how they might react to it. What do we do with the Egyptian pyramids? We dig below them to see what's there. How do we communicate to future generations? Be careful, this high-level radioactive waste is very problematic. As far as I'm concerned, we need a whole lot more global discussion about what we're doing. And there's this simple idea, yes, the small nuclear modular reactors are a solution. I don't think that's been thought through at all.
So we have to close this session. Thank you so much for that reminder, because I was thinking just to include one more question, but sorry for these time limitations. So thank you so much for all of you. And I think we have the last session now, but before that, thanks again. Thank you so much.